Hello again, dear listeners, wherever you may be in time and space. To continue a complete reading of the 1919 novel Jurgen, A Comedy of Justice by James Branch Cabell. And here is Chapter 24 of Compromises in Conseil. Thus, Jurgen abode for a little over 2 months in Conseil and complied with the customs of that country. Nothing altered in Conseil, but in the world wherein Jurgen was reared, he knew it would by this time be September, with the leaves flaring gloriously and the birds flocking southward, and the hearts of Jurgen's fellows turning to not unpleasant regrets. But in Conseil there was no regret and no variability, but only an interminable flow of curious pleasures, illumined by the wandering star of Venus Machinitis. "Why is it, then, that I am not content?" said Jurgen. "And what thing is this which I desire? It seems to me there is some injustice being perpetrated upon Jurgen somewhere." Meanwhile, he lived with Anytis, the son's daughter, very much as he had lived with Lisa, who was daughter to a pawnbroker. Anytis displayed upon the whole a milder temper, in part because she could confidently look forward to several centuries more of life before being explained away by the philologists, and so had less need than Dame Lisa to worry over temporal matters, and in part because there was less to ruin one's disposition in 2 months than in 10 years of Jurgen's company. Anytis nagged and sulked for a while when her prince consort slackened in the pursuit of strange delights, as he did very soon, with frank confession that his tastes were simple and that these outlandish refinements bored him. Later, Anytis seemed to despair of his ever becoming proficient in curious pleasures, and she permitted Jurgen to lead a comparatively normal life, with only an occasional and half-hearted remonstrance. What puzzled Jurgen was that she did not seem to tire of him, and he would often wonder what this lovely myth, so skilled and potent in arts wherein he was the merest bungler, could find to care for in Jurgen. For now they lived together like any other humdrum married couple, and their occasional exchange of endearments was as much a matter of course as their meals, and hardly more exciting. Poor dear, I believe it is simply because I am a monstrous clever fellow. She distrusts my cleverness. She very often disapproves of it, and yet she values it as queer as a sort of curiosity. In Conseil? So Anytis petted and pampered her prince consort, and took such open pride in his queerness as very nearly embarrassed him sometimes. She could not understand his attitude of polite amusement toward his associates and the events which befell him, and even toward his own doings and traits. Whatever happened, Jurgen shrugged and delicately avoiding actual laughter, evinced amusement. Anytis could not understand this at all, of course, since Asian myths are remarkably destitute of humor. To Jurgen in private she protested that he ought to be ashamed of his levity. But none the less she would draw him out when among the bestial and grim nature myths, and she would glow visibly with fond pride in Jurgen's queerness. "She mothers me," reflected Jurgen. "Upon my word, I believe that in the end this is the only way in which females are capable of loving. And she is a dear and lovely creature of whom I am sincerely fond. What is this thing, then, that I desire? Why do I feel life is not treating me quite justly? So the summer had passed, and Anytus traveled a great deal, being a popular myth in every land. Her sense of duty was so strong that she endeavored to grace in person all the peculiar festivals held in her honor, and thus now the harvest season was at hand, left her with hardly a moment disengaged. Then, too, the mission of Anytus was to divert, and there were so many people whom she had personally to visit, so many notable ascetics who were advancing straight toward canonization and whom her underlings were unable to divert, that Anytus was compelled to pass night after night in unwholesome, comfortless surroundings, in monasteries and in the cells and caves of hermits. "You are wearing yourself out, my darling," Jurgen would say. "And does it not seem, after all, a game that is hardly worth the candle? I know that, for my part, before I would travel so many miles into a desert and then climb 100-foot pillar just to whisper diverting notions into an anchorite's very dirty ear, I would let the gaunt rascal go to heaven. But you associate so much with saintly persons that you have contracted their incapacity for seeing the humorous side of things. Well, you are a dear even so. Here is a kiss for you, and do you come back to your adoring husband as soon as you conveniently can without neglecting your duty." They report that the Stylites is very far gone in rectitude, said Anytus absent-mindedly as she prepared for the journey, but I have hopes for him. This Stylites. Then Anytus put purple powder on her hair and hastily got together a few beguiling devices and went into the Thebaid. Jurgen went back to the library, and the system of worshipping a girl and the unique manuscripts of Astinasa and Elephantis and Sotades, and the Dionysic formulae, and the chart of postures, and the litany of the center of delight, and the Spintrian treatises, and the 32 gratifications, and innumerable other volumes which he found instructive. The library was a vaulted chamber, having its walls painted with the 12 asan of Cyrene. The ceiling was frescoed with the arched body of a woman, whose toes rested upon the cornice of the east wall and whose outstretched fingertips touched the cornice of the western wall. The clothing of this painted woman was remarkable, and to Jurgen her face was not unfamiliar. "Who is that?" he inquired to Anytus. Looking a little troubled, Anytus told him this was Astrid. "Well, I have heard her called otherwise, and I have seen her in quite other clothing." "You have seen Astrid?" "Yes, with a kitchen towel about her head, and otherwise unostentatiously apparelled, but very becomingly, I can assure you." Here Jurgen glanced sideways at his shadow, and he cleared his throat. "Oh, and a most charming and a most estimable old lady I found this Astrid to be, I can assure you also." "I would prefer to know nothing about it," said Anytus hastily. "I would prefer, for both our sakes, that you say no more of Astrid." Jurgen shrugged. Now, in the library of Conseil was garnered a record of all that the nature myths had invented in the way of pleasure. And here, with no companion save his queer shadow, and with Astrid arched above and bleakly regarding him, Jurgen spent most of his time, rather agreeably, in investigating and meditating upon the more curious of these recreations. The painted asan were, in all conscience, food for wonder. But over and above these dozen surprising pastimes, the books of Anytus revealed to Jurgen without disguise or reticence every other far-fetched frolic of heathenry. Hitherto unheard of forms of diversion were unveiled to him, and every recreation which ingenuity had been able to contrive for the gratifying of the most subtle and the most strong-stomached tastes. No possible sort of amusement would seem to have been omitted in running the quaint gamut of refinements upon nature which Anytus and her cousins had at odd moments invented to satiate their desire for some more suave or more strange or more sanguinary pleasure. Yet the deeper Jurgen investigated and the longer he meditated, the more certain it seemed to him that all such employment was a peculiarly unimaginative pursuit of happiness. I am willing to taste any drink once, so I must give diversion a fair trial, but I am afraid these are the games of mental childhood. Well, that reminds me, I promised the children to play with them for a while before supper. So he came out, and presently, brave in the shirt of Nessus, and mimicked in every action by that incongruous shadow, Prince Jurgen was playing tag with the three little Eunamids, the daughters of Anytus by her former marriage with Acheron, the king of midnight. Anytus and the dark potentate had parted by mutual consent. Acheron meant well, she would say with a forgiving sigh, and that in the moon's absence he occasionally diverted travelers, I do not deny. But he did not understand me. And Jurgen agreed that this tragedy sometimes befell even the unapproachably diverting. The three Eumenides at this period were half-grown girls whom their mother was carefully tutoring to drive guilty persons mad by the stings of conscience. And very quaint it was to see the young furies at practice in the schoolroom, black-robed and waving lighted torches, and crowned each with her garland of pet serpents. They became attached to Jurgen, who was always fond of children, and who had frequently regretted that Dame Lisa had borne him none. It is enough to get the poor dear a name for eccentricity, he had been used to say. So Jurgen now made much of his stepchildren, and indeed he found their innocent prattle quite as intelligent in essentials as the talk of the full-grown nature myths who infested the palace of Anytus. And the four of them, Jurgen and critical Alecto, the grave Thisphani, and fairy-like little Megara, would take long walks and play with their dolls, although Alecto was a trifle condescending toward dolls, and romp together in the eternal evening of Conseil, and discuss what sort of dresses and trinkets mother would probably bring them when she came back from Ecbatana or Lesbos, and would generally enjoy themselves. Rather pathetically earnest and unimaginative little lasses, Jurgen found the young Eumenides, and inherited much of their mother's narrow-mindedness, if not their father's brooding and glooming tendencies. But in them narrow-mindedness showed merely as amusing, and Jurgen loved them, and would often reflect with a pity it was that these dear little girls were destined, when they reached maturity, to spend the rest of their lives in haunting criminals and adulterers and parricides, and generally such persons as most inevitably tarnished the girls' outlook upon life, and lead them to see too much of the worst side of human nature. So Jurgen was content enough, but still he was not actually happy, not even among the endless pleasures of Conseil. And what is this thing that I desire, he would ask himself again and again. and still he did not know. He merely felt he was not getting justice, and a dim sense of this would trouble him even while he was playing with the Humanite. So, chapter 25, Cantraps of the Master Philologist. But now, as has been recorded, it was September, and Jurgen could see that Anytus too was worrying over something. She kept it from him as long as possible, first said it was nothing at all, and then said he would know it soon enough, then wept a little over the possibility that he would probably be very glad to hear it, and eventually told him. For in becoming the consort of a nature myth connected with the moon, Jurgen had of course exposed himself to the danger of being converted into a solar legend by the philologists, and in that event would be compelled to leave concierge with the equinox to enter into autumnal exploits elsewhere. And Anytus was quite heartbroken over the prospect of losing Jurgen. For I have never had such a prince consort and concierge, so maddening and so helpless and so clever, and the girls are so fond of you, although they have not been able to get on at all with so many of their stepfathers. And I know that you are flippant and heartless, but you have quite spoiled me for other men. No, Jurgen, there is no need to argue, for I have experimented with at least a dozen lovers lately when I was traveling, and they bored me insufferably. They had, as you put it, dear, no conversation. And you are the only young man I have found in all these ages who could talk interestingly. There is a reason for that, since like you, Anytus, I am not so youthful as I appear. I do not care a straw about appearances, wept Anytus, but I know that I love you, and that you must be leaving me with the equinox unless you can settle matters with the master philologist. Well, my pet, says Jurgen, the Jews got into Jericho by trying. He armed and girded himself with caliburn, drank a couple of bottles of wine, put on the shirt of Nessus over all, and then went to seek the thaumaturgist. Anytus showed him the way to an unpretentious residence, where a week's washing was drying and flapping in the side yard. Jurgen knocked boldly, and after an interval the door was opened by the master philologist himself. You must pardon this informality, he said, blinking through his great spectacles, which had dust on them. But time was by ill luck arrested hereabouts on a Thursday evening, and so the maid is out indefinitely. I would suggest, therefore, that the lady wait outside upon that porch, for the neighbors to see her go in would not be respectable. Do you know what I have come for, says Jurgen, blustering and splendid in his glittering shirt and his gleaming armor, for I warn you I am justice. I think you are lying, and I am sure you are making an unnecessary noise. In any event, justice is a word, and I control all words. I believe that is so, said the master philologist, still blinking, just as the Jewish mob spoke louder than he whom they crucified. But the word endures. You are a quibbler. You are my guest, so I advise you in pure friendliness not to impugn the power of my words. Said Jurgen scornfully, but in justice then, a word? Oh yes, It is one of the most useful. It is the Spanish justica, the Portuguese justica, the Italian gustazia, and from the Latin justus. Oh yes, indeed, but justice is one of the most connected words and one of the best trained also, I can assure you. Aha! And to what degraded uses do you put this poor, enslaved, intimidated justice? There is but one intelligent use, said the master philologist, unruffled, for anybody to make of words. I will explain it to you. If you will come in out of this treacherous draught, one never knows what a cold may lead to. Then the door closed upon them, and Aniatus waited outside in some trepidation. Presently Jurgen came out of that unpretentious residence and so back to Aniatus discomforted. Jurgen flung down his magic sword, charmed Caliburn. This, Aniatus, I perceive to be an outmoded weapon. There is no weapon like words, no armor against words, and with words the master philologist has conquered me. It is not at all equitable, but the man showed me a huge book wherein were the names of everything in the world, and justice was not among them. It develops that, instead, justice is merely a common noun, vaguely denoting an ethical idea of conduct proper to the circumstances, whether of individuals or communities. It is, you observe, just a grammarian's notion. But what has he decided about you, Jurgen? Alas, dear Aniatus, he has decided, in spite of all that I could do, to derive Jurgen from jargon, indicating a confused chattering such as birds give forth at sunrise. Thus ruthlessly does the master philologist convert me into a solar legend. So the affair is settled, and we must part, my darling. Aniatus took up the sword. But this is valuable, since the man who wields it is the mightiest of warriors. It is a rush, a rotten twig, a broom straw against the insidious weapons of the master philologist. But keep it, if you like, my dear, and give it to your next prince consort. I am ashamed to have trifled with such toys, says Jurgen in fretted disgust. And besides, the master philologist assures me I shall mount far higher through the aid of this. But what is on that bit of parchment? 32 of the master philologist's own words that I begged of him. See, my dear, he made this cantrap for me with his own hand and ink. And Jurgen read from the parchment impressively. At the death of Adrian V, Pedro Giuliani, who should be named John the 20th, was through an error in the reckoning elevated to the papal chair as John the 21st. Said Aniatus blankly, and is that all? Why, yes, and surely 32 whole words should be enough for the most exacting. But is it magic? Are you certain it is authentic magic? I have learned that there is always magic in words. Now, if you ask my opinion, Jurgen, your cantrap is nonsense and can never be of any earthly use to anybody. Without boasting, dear, I have handled a great deal of black magic in my day, but I never encountered a spell at all like this. Nonetheless, my darling, it is evidently a cantrap, for else the master philologist would never have given it to me. But how are you to use it, pray? Why, as need directs, said Jurgen, and he put the parchment into the pocket of his glittering shirt. Yes, I repeat, there is always something to be done with words, and here are 32 authentic words from the master philologist himself, not to speak of 3 commas and a full stop. Oh, I shall certainly go far with this. We women have firmer faith in the sword, replied Aniatus. At all events, you and I cannot remain upon this thaumaturgist's porch indefinitely. So Aniatus put up Caliburn and carried it from the thaumaturgist's unpretentious residence to her fine palace in the old twilit wood. And afterward, as everybody knows, she gave this sword to King Arthur, who with its aid rose to be hailed as one of the 9 worthies of the world. So did the husband of Guinevere win for himself eternal fame with that which Jurgen flung away. All right. Archiving these recordings on the Roarshock channel at YouTube. I understand that Periscope will remain as an archive, so this recording is going to be many places, and I'll be back soon to continue the reading. And everybody who listens in, I hope you enjoy it, and I appreciate your listening in. See you soon. Bye. Or hear you soon. Or I'll be back soon.